Hello and welcome to the 54th edition of the Be Life podcast, coming to you live from Canton. Well, I don't know if we're live, it's recorded, but it's Canton Nazarene Church in Canton, Ohio. I'm Joe, this is Josh, and we have a special guest for you today. And I'm excited about talking to this gentleman. And Josh, I'm going to let you introduce him since you're the one that brought him on and invited him on to the show.
Yeah, it's been really great as the show's been going on. We've had some people that are listening, some local people, some people a little further away. And it's sparking conversations, which is exactly one of our goals that we have here. And so a good friend of mine said, hey, you mentioned a couple episodes. You were talking about physics. You're talking about the laws of physics and how that might change the way we understand God. And my friend said, I know a physicist, my cousin, and he's pretty qualified, pretty smart guy. We should have him on to talk. And so today we are joined by David Leoy. If you want to give your formal introduction, give us some of your background, your qualifications. Do you have any letters behind your name?
PhD, I guess, would be the...
That's something, man. That takes a lot of work to get there.
Yes, it did.
Especially in physics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
You have to find a moon or something like that to do that in physics.
Oh, yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me on. My name's David Leoy. I have a PhD in physics. My undergrad was at Ohio State, and I got a chemistry and physics degrees there. And as far as we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the things that I've done and some of the things that I do. I've been a Christian since I was 4 years old, and when I was younger, grew up in a large family, and we all loved to talk and loved to argue and loved to discuss various things, and I grew up listening to most of that. And so most of my family are actually artists, and some of that rubbed off on me a little bit. I always would say growing up that I would try to copy some or mimic what I saw in my older siblings quite a bit. And I would read a lot. And so one of my favorite authors at the time was C.S. Lewis, and read a lot of his stuff. And I liked him the most because when I would be thinking about things and I would be trying to take what I knew and predict stuff from that, he often was explaining things in the same direction that I had been thinking. And so that was kind of how I grew up. Once again, as far as my physics background is concerned, I talked a little bit about how in graduate school, the emphasis of the department was in astrophysics, and we talked about dark matter and dark energy a little bit. But my actual research study was in quantum mechanics. And so I'm an experimental quantum mechanics physicist, and worked with the Department of Energy up at Argonne National Labs for a little bit. Did various things as far as all of that's concerned. Was a physics professor at Drexel University for a small stint, just in a teaching position. It was just for a little bit of time there. And but quantum mechanics and experimentalism was where, that's my profession.
David, let me ask you a question. For those of us who aren't, I was an English major. I stayed away from algebra and, well, I actually stayed away from fractions. But I want people, I don't understand what physics is. I don't understand where physics fits in the whole realm of science. And then, if you don't mind, I know we want to get into how this relates with Christianity and the whole thing, but I think it's important that people like me understand what physics is and what quantum mechanics is. If you can possibly explain those in 5 words or less, it'd be great.
Oh, okay, I was with you until the 5 words or less.
Go ahead.
So there's a couple ways of talking about physics. So imagine, let's see. So there's a couple of ways of phrasing it. If I was talking to you as a scientist, what I would say is, and like to other scientists, and trying to explain what physics is, then I would say, okay, so we're trying to describe the universe and the principles of how the universe works, and the way that physicist fits into society, I would say, is that my profession, my job, and the reason why I have a salary and why society supports me is that my task is to go into the universe as far as like principles and first principles and axioms and how our understanding of that works, and extract from that knowledge and use it as a lever to do something. So basically, it's the conversion of truth into power. That is what a physicist does. And a physicist usually occupies all that on the area of that very close to just the discovery of truth. And then we'll write about it. We will put it into journals, and then other people will try to take the lessons that we learn and convert them into some kind of strength, whether it's a technology, whether it's a medicine, whether anything. It's, can you use this to move the world? And so that's the relevancy of it. And so, and that's why it's different than an art or different than other things like this, where you're actually taking your knowledge and you're converting it into like some kind of technology, which is an exertion of power within the world. And yeah, so that's fundamentally as my place in society where it is. As far as where the field of physics differs from other fields, it's because of the assumptions that we have. So typically a physicist, so the difference between a chemist and a physicist, for example, is that a chemist assumes that matter can't be created or destroyed. A physicist relaxes that assumption and says, okay, matter can be created and destroyed, and that's what nuclear power is, actually. That's the E equals mc squared. So that is an assumption that chemistry does not have, that chemistry has, that matter can't be created or destroyed, and everything in that is in the realm of chemistry and how matter is basically reorganized. And then physics is you're basically describing the universe with one less assumption, and that wasn't quite true, but it was a good approximation for where you wanted to be. And so yeah, so physicist is about, yeah, and matter can be created and destroyed, and that converts into energy. And as far as the disciplines that exist currently, it's the one with the fewest assumptions, and the ones where if we're trying to narrow down to what are the base principles on which the universe operates, that's what our job is. So if I was to describe, and there's several metaphors that I've used on this over the years, but if I was to describe it, imagine what we have to do is we have to say, okay, there's all of this observed phenomena around here, and we have to understand the layer below what gives rise to each of those phenomena. And then we have to go a layer lower, and then a layer lower, and then a layer lower, until you get down to, you can't reduce these things anymore. They're not, you get down to an axiom where it's not dependent on something else. And
Does it feel at that point, does it ever feel like you're so far from tangible reality that what even are we talking about?
so if you're a theorist, but if you're an experimentalist,
Okay.
you're always checking it. So basically, what you're doing is you're always constructing a theory. It's all back to the scientific method. You construct a theory, you go out, you make a set of propositions, you test that, you take that, and you revise your theory, and you just keep going. So you're always, so that's the thing about that separates like a science from a philosophy, for example, is that we have that root reality, that root truth to check ourselves again in a consistent way that we can keep revising our theory back up against.
I have to ask you a question, David, right now, because it's going to blow up in my head if I don't.
Okay.
Uh, you're a Christian,
Yes.
so you obviously believe in the Bible, God's word.
Yes.
Do you have to take this and take this physics, this study, and separate it and say, hey, look, I got to put this on the shelf
Not at all.
because it really doesn't fit with this? How do you make those two work?
Okay, so yeah, so let's get into that. So one fundamental assumption, so there are a couple of fundamental assumptions of physics, right? And one of the fundamental assumptions is that you're only dealing with one universe. And that universe has to be self-consistent. There can't be any internal inconsistencies. There can't be any dissonances. If this part of the theory conflicts with this part of the theory and makes a paradox, that can't exist. And what we find is that whenever our theories have paradoxes in them, that was actually the key to understanding what was underneath those two phenomena that seem to be conflicting. But one of the and people don't talk about this too much, but there are no paradoxes in physics. And so it has to be internally consistent. If you're using music, there can't be dissonances. It has to all be complementary to each
When
other.
you say paradox, what do you mean? You have to talk to me as if I'm a 3-year-old when it comes to physics. And I want our listeners I want to assume that they're coming from the same perspective as me, although many of them are probably much brighter than I am. But when you say there's paradox, what do you mean by that, David?
So two things that can't coexist in the same universe, or so in a logic or mathematical sense, that is like saying, I am not here, but I am also just here. Like two things that are mutually exclusive from each other. That's what a paradox is. Like
Okay.
two statements that are just mutually exclusive from each other. And so in physics, you can't have mutually exclusive statements about reality, basically. And like to us, it's like, of course, but that one thing right there there's actually a lot of consequences from it.
So in the universe, we have one universe, and there are no paradoxes in that universe.
Yes, for example, and another way of saying that mathematically is that there are no infinities. Nature doesn't like infinities. An example of what some of our theories say is infinity is a black hole. So where gravity goes to infinity. So we can't, like, that's a really hard thing to study. Our models make it go to infinity, but that's one of those places that people are looking to be like, okay, there's an infinity here, but that means that there's something that we don't know. And so we need to be studying this thing, for example.
Okay. And so how does that fit with creation, with God, with the biblical account of the world, of the universe?
And so so the first is things have to be consistent. The second is when you're as a scientist, when I'm trying to find those axioms, so trace back from the observable. So think of it as sensory things. The analogy I always like to use is I imagine you have a galaxy and you have stars in the center. They're very large stars. They control everything. Those are your axioms. Then there's outer layers that slowly get smaller and smaller, and they get less. They affect everything less until you get to the very end where you just have small stars that are out at the perimeter, and that's like your sensory observable things. But they're all dependent on the axioms, and so our job is you have all of this observable phenomena and you're tracing back down to the axioms that they are dependent on. So these axioms give rise to all of these stars out here.
And where do you find God in that?
And so when you're tracing back to these axioms, you're tracing back to physics axioms. However, there are certain things that we have or behavior or things about life and reality that we can't actually trace back to those axioms. For example, our entire Western civilization is based off of the way that individuals are agents, can make decisions. And so imagine that, and that's something that as a physicist, when somebody is a mover or a first principle, like the action is derived from them, that's something beyond which physics can't really talk about. So, for example, it has to do with if I am a person and I commit an act, I own that act. You can trace it back to me, and that's why I committed a crime because I'm an owner. I'm an owner of that act. Similarly, the way all of our intellectual property laws are set up is that if I think of something and create that thing out of what I made, then I own that intellectual property. So, from a physicist, if you're just thinking from a physics perspective, there you have the same amount of matter and energy that you had before and after those events. Like chairs don't exist as far as physics is concerned. Chairs don't exist. This microphone doesn't exist. The TV doesn't exist as an abstract concept, because it's, where do you find the chair and the atoms? It's in the arrangement of them, effectively, and the intellectual concept of them, that abstraction, that is that is something that we have put on top of it, and all of that stuff comes from us as agents, as first movers. And the reason why we think, okay, if a person is brainwashed and they go and do something, it's the person who brainwashed them that's responsible for it, because their
So
agency has been removed. And so
can
that, oh, sorry.
I stop you a minute?
Hmm.
And forgive me for this, because I'm getting more confused.
Okay.
And you have to forgive me for that.
It's fine.
But I'm trying to say, are you saying that as you go back into the cause of the universe and you keep going back, you will get to a point where you have to accept that there had to be a creator, or you have to accept, in other words, if you can't find a cause at the end, you have to assume that that cause was outside of the universe.
I guess what I was describing there was that if you accept that there are axioms in the world that give rise to phenomena, then things like morality, things like us being able to make decisions that are ours and ours alone, if you count those as phenomena, they trace back to different axioms other than the physical ones.
Got it.
So there must be something beyond
So
the
there must be
physical
something
universe.
beyond physics. And so you can trace
Thank
back,
you.
yeah, so you
Yes.
can trace back to the axioms in physics. And let's say now we're talking about like the beginning of time. And so if time began, if the universe began, then the implication of that is, once again, that those axioms aren't actually quite axioms. They're axioms from the physics perspective, but they were dependent on something else.
How often do you find that process happening, of working back to a place where physics and philosophy are meeting, and you're not sure how to make sense of it? How often does that happen in your field of study?
So stuff like that, if you're talking about going back to the edge of something like that, and
Yeah.
so then you're not talking as a physicist anymore, because like I said, a physicist has certain assumptions, and those assumptions are, my axiom is that I'm going to end at these axioms, or wherever this trail leads me, and I'm going to stop there, and anything beyond that is beyond my field.
And you feel okay, like, recognizing, right? Because as a physicist, you're explaining everything that we see and observe around us, right? But you're okay with accepting that there's more that exists in the universe beyond the observable, beyond what physics is able to explain and cover. And do you feel, have you come across physicists that don't accept that?
Great question.
Yeah, so it depends on, so the way all of that works out is that it depends on your field as to where people tend to fall onto that particular question. If you're in the humanities, like the trend is that the closer you are to the humanities where the human is the center of everything, you are more likely to find atheists. If you go into the hard scientists or astrophysics, where you're looking outward and you see, and humanity is no longer the center point of the thing that you're studying, you'll tend to find a lot more Christians or religious people.
Why do you think that correlation exists?
It's like, uh, what is at the center of what you're focusing on? If you're looking out at the stars and realize, oh, I am an incredibly small person and everything, like, what in the world who am I? Then you're a lot more open to thinking along those terms. Whereas if humanity and yourself is at the center of everything that you do, it goes back to just normal human relations and normal Christian views on the topic in general. Like, it's nothing special about physics at that point, or about science in general.
Interesting.
Does science, David, does a scientist always assume that a particular phenomenon or event always has a natural cause. Is science predicated on the fact that every event has to have a natural cause?
As long as you're viewing it as a scientist, then yes, because you're always doing that action of tracing the observable down to physical axioms. Like that's what the profession is. As a
So how
person who
do,
is a scientist, that's a different question because I do not trace me doing a certain action back to a physical phenomena because of it originated from my own mind necessarily.
It's
Like,
just at that point, it's outside of science.
correct, exactly. You can trace it back to the brain and the physiology of it, but then then you can talk about I traced axioms back to the beginning of time. You can also trace it back to the level of quantum mechanics actually because and this kind of gets into one of your other questions. So when you get down to the infinitesimal, so like you're going smaller and smaller time scales or even physical scales, you'll find that the world kind of gets blurry in the sense that it's intrinsically blurry. So in quantum, so one of the things that I have some papers on is, and just to kind of give you an idea of the scale and the listeners, some of the idea of the scale is that one of the things I did was that we use lasers in the Department of Energy that operated at the femtosecond time scale. So think of a nanosecond, which is 10 to the minus 9 seconds. It's much smaller than that. A femtosecond is 10 to the minus 15 seconds. And so, just to kind of give you an idea, at 10 to the minus 12, that's when you start to see molecules vibrate. 10 to the minus
wow.
15 is so like our lasers would be able to, could watch molecules vibrate. That's what I would do for a while there actually. And
So when the layperson's thinking about lasers, right, and they're thinking about like blaster guns from Star Wars, the thing that's going to cut James Bond in half, lasers are not like that, but they're still pretty awesome. If you're saying that you can watch molecules vibrate,
yeah, you can watch molecules vibrate. So like the pulsing of the laser is every like one every 10 femtoseconds basically, and at that time scale, which is 3 orders of magnitude smaller than watching the oscillations, you can start to see electrons interacting with each other. That's the time scale on which electrical things start to happen.
And,
But at those time scales, and once you go down to even smaller than that, so that's in time. In space, if I was to go down to a nanometer, that's on the level of a molecule. Uh, if you go, so that's 10 to the minus 9 meters. If you go 10 to the minus 10 meters, that's the size of an atom. And if you start to get a little bit smaller than that, and we have microscopes that resolve things on atomic length scales actually, but once you start getting down to there, so the whole point of all of this is that once you start to get down into that scale of space, you deal with like the universe kind of gives in different directions. So we call them uncertainty principles. And so we say there's a fundamental uncertainty between something's momentum, how fast it's traveling with however mass, let's say, on a macro scale, and its position. So effectively, if you know something's position, you know it to a point, like it's right there mathematically, then there's an uncertainty of what its momentum is, which direction it's traveling. And so if you squeeze the position down, you make this thing very uncertain, the momentum uncertain. And if you squeeze the momentum down so you know exactly which way it's traveling, you have no idea where it is.
and if I may, can I bring you back? Um, I'm trying to figure this out in my head, and I asked the question about science, general science, not necessarily you or whatever, because you have a different perspective on science based on your faith. But science as a whole has to have a natural cause to explain a phenomena. Is that correct? Science in general.
Let's see. Science as a profession does that, yes. Science as a profession has to have, or it seeks out a natural cause, yes.
And so science in general could not would not accept a miracle, a biblical miracle.
I wouldn't go that far.
Why? And I'm serious. I really would like to know.
And this is why I was kind of talking about like our actions and like us being actions and first movers within our world, for example, agents in our world, I should say, is because as far as science is concerned, that is a miracle.
What is a miracle?
Me choosing to do something and me being morally culpable for that choice.
But that is something naturally that you can explain. That's different than Jesus being resurrected from the dead. That's a phenomenon. That's an event. That's not an inside moral responsibility. It's more of an action. So I guess what I'm saying, David, is yes, you can have things that you can do, I can act on that can be something that I make a choice of. But when you're outside of it, you're a scientist or you're just a person watching an event, and Jesus rises from the dead and appears to people and walks around. That is impossible for science to understand and to justify because there is no natural cause for that.
Right. So like the act in that example, the act of the raising of the dead, that's the miracle, and science has nothing to say about that. It would be outside of it, for example. But from that moment, as far as like then how does he interact, like how all of that stuff, that would be because it would just be like normal life. In the same, and this is why I say in the same way that science has nothing to say as to why you made that thought or why you
I get
made
it.
that action. So
I
that
get
is
it.
also outside of it. And so
After it happens.
after it happens, once it's transmitted and it goes down the nerves and it's going into your hands and you do the thing, that's science. But the why, the origination of it, that's not science that's not physics anymore, I should say.
Wow.
So do you feel like you keep using the term agency, and I feel like the closest correlation, the closest term that we have in religion is free will. And that's something that we talk about and people will debate. But I feel like most Orthodox Christians will accept that we all have free will. And so what you're saying is in relation to science, every time we make a decision using our free will, that's a miracle because it's beyond the explanation of natural science. But we've just become almost desensitized to it, right? Because we're making choices all the time.
Exactly. And so, and let's say you adopt the position that, okay, you don't actually make choices. And so like this would be the materialist atheist perspective. And so like I said before, the universe needs to be self-consistent. And so you can start adopting different theories to kind of explain what you have. And let's say you adopt the position that no, you are not morally culpable, then all of a sudden all of Western civilization breaks down because how do you assign a crime? Is it like how do you get punished for the thing that you had no control over, for example? And
I would argue, David, real quick, that's kind of where we're going. That we've gotten to the point where everything is relative. Morality is relative. Am I wrong in that?
also, so what happens? So this is what I like to think of this as a civilizational sin, if that's something that's adopted civilization wide. And what happens is that with a civilizational sin is that the society will, because what the theory of the society is not matching up to the world, it will dissolve and collapse, and then that will fall out of the world, and the ones that held those views will still be there, and they'll be the one that you die, the civilization will die, and the other civilizations that don't have that particular sin will continue going.
So sometimes in biblical in theology, we talk about the natural consequences of sin, right? Sometimes we talk about sin as like, you've done something wrong, God is going to punish you for it. But we also recognize like we do wrong things and it hurts us and it hurts the people around us, and there's natural consequences. And the Bible definitely does talk about, as you call them, civilizational sins, or the Bible say like the sins of our father, the sins of our people, our nation. And so what you're saying is that sometimes those natural consequences of sin can bear fruit and affect an entire society.
Yes, and so and it has to do with like I said at the very beginning, my profession is about taking truth and making strength or power out of it. And so that's what a theory is only as good as its ability to adhere to what is true. Like only as good as how true it is. And however true it is, you'll be able to get that much amount of strength in it in whatever arena of the reality that it's describing. And so with that one, it's because it's a civilizational kind of a thing, and it's about longevity over time. And so if you lose strength in that way that you can progress across time, then this generation will die out, and whatever it passed on, that's what propagates across time. And if that becomes weak, then it's a survival of the fittest thing in that sense of the word, basically. But the survival of the fittest kind of expression is basically, hey, the universe is continually testing you, and are you built on a rock? Effectively is what that statement is like, I would say.
Do you, do
Yeah,
you, do you sleep at night?
I do. I have to turn it
Me-
off though. I actually have to consciously turn it off.
Because I'm blown away by how I still haven't figured out in my head, David, how you balance these two. How it's almost like the, the dyslexic agnostic
Go on, Cook, man.
who lays in bed at night contemplating the existence of dog.
Okay.
I'm trying to fit how this vast. I mean, I'm blown away by your intelligence. I'm blown away by the things in your mind, the things that you contemplate that I could never ever grasp. Um, my and then how it relates to a God who says, stop being so wise, give it all up to me, surrender who you are, bring your intelligence, let me fill you with my intelligence. I have all the answers of the universe, and yet you are still plugging away at finding the answers. And I don't mean that badly. I think it's phenomenal. But I don't know if I would probably be exploding in my head trying to live these two lives. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think I do, in a sense, but from my perspective, it's not two lives; it's still one life. So, and it's all very self-consistent in the sense that, like, if I was to, like, there's a certain amount of humility to the profession, and this is another way that I would say it. If 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 the rocks cry out that Jesus Christ is Lord, then my profession is just studying rocks and how they cry out and proclaim that Jesus Christ is Lord.
I like that.
Wow.
that's
Yeah.
that's enough. So what I've described so far is that viewing physics from within the profession, viewing it from a civilizational and a human perspective, then if you're talking about from more of a theological or from a God's perspective, then all I'm doing is studying rocks and seeing how they proclaim the glory of the Lord, basically.
But you're okay with not finding the answer. In other words, and let me can the supernatural cause a natural event? Okay. So if a supernatural causes a natural event, like the rocks to cry out, you may never find that answer because it's a supernatural cause.
Well, what if the rocks crying out is in the language that I'm researching them under? In the sense that the glory of the Lord is how all of this interconnects and how he built all of it and how it interconnected, and that is them crying out.
Yeah. So you found the answer, you found the result, but you did not find the cause.
As a way of maybe a way of putting it would be all of these things lead back to God. And so like as I trace it back to like the axioms at the beginning of time or the axioms at whatever, and then hey, this is still then to find, hey, this is still open-ended and it's saying there's something else beyond it, then
Yes.
that's still the same. But like I've gone as far as like that particular method of trailing back to it, just like I can, as I see you, there's photons that are coming from the screen, go into my eye, from my eye to my brain, and it's registering. But this the photon that came from the screen came all the way back from, it was an electrical signal transmitted over the airwaves coming from entering your camera, going back to you, and then interacting through. So I can trace all of that back and forth physically, but at the end of the day, it's from somebody.
Yes. And so you have the distinct advantage over a scientist who doesn't know God, because at the end of the day, you can trace things back to God, whereas that person will never find the cause in a miracle, in a supernatural cause.
Do you feel like that's a conversation that you have with your peers?
Uh,
Like,
typically, it's like they're not nearly as conversational as me on this particular topic. But what ends up happening is that when somebody, and this is related to a much larger conversation that I could have on this particular topic, but when your theory of the world restricts yourself from thinking about things beyond the physical, for example, that be effectively, and you like refuse to acknowledge anything beyond it, then that is restricting your world, and you will live like that. That's your method. That's the way that you operate. So it becomes, it's like your world is smaller. And a way that I could describe it would be, imagine that you really had no conception of after next week or after a week prior to now. Everything was just constricted to a certain amount of time. That's kind of how it would feel, I would imagine. And we ourselves do this, like the more I think about things that are happening next year, or thinking about things that are across longer and longer expensive time or farther and farther out, I start to lose a little bit of my fidelity like in the here and now, and vice versa. You can do that vice versa as well. And so with them, it's like their world becomes restricted, and it's like never leaving your hometown.
yeah, yeah.
It's that kind of a thing. Is how the closest I would describe it.
Wow. I would have to think that most scientists, and tell me, I'm making general statements and I'm throwing these out like toilet paper on a wall. So just tell me if I'm wrong. Um, but I would think most scientists, because they have to look for a natural cause for a supernatural event. Because they cannot find a natural cause for an event such as the resurrection, then to them, ultimately, they cannot admit that they can't find a cause for that. So in their mind, it can't exist. So miracles, and I'm going down a path here, and at the end, you could tell me to go jump in a lake, but they, because they can't find a cause, they say that miracle could not have existed because it doesn't have a cause, and the cause is supernatural, and they can't find the cause to it. And because they can't find a cause to a miracle, then there cannot be a God who would make that miracle happen. So most scientists who would go down the line of being atheist. Am I correct?
So no, because that's only if you have to make the statement that only physical act, like the physical is the only, you have to make the assumption that the physical is the only thing that mattered. And
And
and not
natural
everyone makes
causes
that,
are the
and
only
not
things
everyone
that
makes,
exist.
yeah, so that not everyone makes that statement. Very
Okay.
few actually make that statement, I would say. Um, and even if they do make that statement and let's say in a theoretical sense, in an intellectual sense, with their, and they say, oh yeah, this is what I think, and then they go out and do something, they behave as if there is something beyond the physical
Oh,
because they behave that morality actually exists. The moment you slight them, for example, it's your fault. It's not something else. So you can, so in that way that there's a cognitive dissonance within themselves,
oh, that's
and
interesting.
they're not actually being intellectually honest in full and taking things at their actual logical conclusion, because if that is true, then these other things about the universe and the way things operate are also true, and they're not willing to accept those, and so they make two spheres that are separate from each other. But once again, if the assumption is that everything is the same universe, there's not separate universes that we have, everything's interconnected, then you can't have that separation. You can't have that dissonance within yourself. And
I
that's why
get it.
that's a very important statement.
That's interesting. How do your mother and father, do they worry about you?
David is different. David is just different. Is
I
all my
mean, I'm assuming you said you were a Christian since you were 4 years old. That means you probably grew up in a Christian home. So your Christian parents and everybody in your family, close family that were Christians, saw you go off in this direction and saw I'm sure growing up when you were 7 and 8, you were already displaying these kind of traits.
Asking dangerous
Yes.
questions.
And so,
there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of
yeah. And then you go off to university and get your PhD in quantum physics. And they're probably thinking, oh, we've lost him. Am I wrong?
No, so actually, like I said, I have a lot of siblings, and I keep as much in contact with as many of them as I can. But like one of my brothers, who's into history along with me, like we talk about literature and history and and this type of philosophical conversation actually, relatively often. Every couple of weeks we try to have a phone call, but like we love talking about stuff like this.
Mhm.
This is just how we grew up, basically.
And your parents have stopped worrying about you?
I would hope. I would hope.
Did you find some pushback from your church community when you displayed either these personality traits or interests, or perhaps pursued this as a career?
Oh no, not at all. Not at
Okay.
all. Yeah, the closest thing to something like that, and that's not even. No, I wouldn't say. The only difference is that, like, for a long time, since I went to a Mennonite church, but I'm not a pacifist myself, I would always be arguing about. I was like, oh, let's have a conversation about this, and sometimes people just get tired of it after a while. And so, but that's the closest thing. The,
Yeah.
the only pushback, as far as pushback is concerned, is that I'm just much more interested in these topics and much more willing to spend hours and hours talking about them than and other people would like I'd rather like go outside and go to the beach or do something like that. And like why are you still talking to me about this?
Do you ever watch the show Big Bang Theory? Okay, you just I feel like you're like the real life version of those characters. You know that they almost struggle to have conversations with other people because they're just like so, you know, they're constantly thinking about how the universe works, and they have different metaphors and analogies for things. Do you feel like you ever struggle to like have conversations with people, or
Well, he did with me today.
Right. Well, so I mean, as far as that's concerned, it's like once again, it's just your all this is about constructing a theory. And your theory is only as good as how true it is, and then it's only as useful at the end of the day as are you going out into the world and using it. And so everyone's just out there using the theories. And so if I just spend all day talking about this and not actually living life and actually implementing the things that I know or that I learn or interacting with other people, then it's all for nothing as well at the same time. And so
yeah?
so as far as those kind of proclivities, like in my earlier years, I would say that I was much more focused on building my understanding of things, and I'm much more on the side now of implementing and actually living out in the world using what I know. If
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
David, do you, if you were to look at, and I'm sure you do, you look at your life, how you live it daily. You just talked about how you're living your life. Do you find yourself living your life as in an evangelical way, a Christian way, or more of a physicist way? When people see you out on the street and how you interact with people, do they see you as a man, as a Christian, or as a physicist? And that may be a hard question, but I wonder how you're perceived by people, and how I also wonder, and part of the question is, how much is living for Christ important to you?
Oh, quite important.
I figured that, but I just
Yeah. So that kind of gets into so to answer the question on the face of it, I would say is that it's not really any different than any other profession as far as that's concerned, but the difference between that and acting as a Christian, for example. Like let's say you're a construction worker. Does somebody see you more as a construction worker than as a Christian? Like it's the same, and with all of life, the same thing is applied. Um,
yes.
the question is just in your personality, and since as a physicist, since you're so weird and different than everybody else.
Sorry about
Well,
my
that's true.
implications from
I
earlier.
that was that was, yes, and I meant it. I'm sorry.
No. I get it all the time. That's the thing. Like, because you look like you're from the Big Bang Theory, like, do people treat you as if you're from the Big Bang Theory first, rather than as a Christian? And it just depends on, and it
Yeah,
just
I'm
depends
sorry.
on like, as far as like, there's first impressions, and then when people get to know you, and then like, is there something that comes up that brings the Christianity, like the principles out? So, for example, so let's say that like somebody will know that I'm a Christian probably by the different things that the ways that I will react in certain circumstances, for example, and the
Mhm.
way that when I say this is why I'm acting in these circumstances, and once again that's just like normal. But as far as the real tie-in between the physicists and the Christianity is that from is that Christ is truth. And I've made a lot of allusions to how important truth is to as a concept to a physicist. Like there's an objective thing, and this thing exists whether you will it or not, regardless of whether you want it to be or not. There is something that is truth. And of all of the religions that I know of, there is none that are like Christianity in the emphasis they place on truth over what the world conceives of as honor, or whatever manifestations that is. And so, for example, if your boss wants you to do something that is corrupt or something along those ends, and there's going to be consequences for that, and you hold to truth and what is true regardless of the consequences, that is a very Christian thing to do, and that's how something like that comes out. And so, yeah, so, and I could go, there's a lot that I could go into in that particular direction, as far as, well, one of the big things I've been thinking about is the relationship of truth versus honor, actually, and how that deals with how Christianity feeds into that, and my conceptions of all of that. But that's also a conversation that is maybe for another time. Or now,
So
or I could go into it now.
Or now.
Yeah, just one of the things that we always try to get to is, and Joe very much so pushes this, is like, how does this impact how we're living for Christ, right? We're Christians first and foremost. How does it change the way we live in the world? How does it impact our relationship with God? And I feel like you have shared some good insight into that. Do you have anything that you've been working on lately, anything you're passionate about that's giving you an opportunity to be life, to be a Christian, a shining light in your life, whether it's in your family or your neighborhood or at work? Do you have something you've been doing lately that you're passionate about?
um Something like that. Like, as far as physics is concerned,
As far as Christianity is
but
concerned.
oh, I see. Well, so the thing about my profession as well is that I bounce around a lot from place to place, and so it's hard to have community. And right now, I guess one of the things that I'm quite passionate about is establishing community where I am for however long that I can.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's going to be long. Maybe it might not be, but I guess that would be one of the things that I'm quite passionate about, is making sure that where I can reach in my neighborhood, in my area, that all of the things that I can bring to bear, I bring to bear as often and as well as I can.
I would I'm going to make a blatant plug for you. We obviously, our church here, Canton Nazarene, we do a live stream service every Sunday at 11 o'clock. So no matter where you are on the road, David, you can tune in and be part of our community and a part of our worship service. And we'd love to have you. And knowing you were there would be important for me. As much as that may seem odd to you, knowing that David was watching us on Sunday and worshiping with us would be a big deal to me. So I'm just making that offer to you. So no matter where you're on the road, you have the one community that you could connect to every Sunday.
Yeah, even if you can't join us live, we're always putting out resources online, whether it's our service or more episodes of the podcast. And so, we try and provide resources for our community. And so I just want to say we're really grateful for your time today and for being a part of this conversation. You brought a lot to it. Thank you for answering our questions, and maybe answering them 4 or 5 times until
Yes,
it was to a point where we could understand it. So thank
Oh,
you
no.
for that.
Also, and thank you for being patient with me, laying a lot of groundwork before I actually answered your questions.
well,
Like,
David, you're an amazing young man. You really are. I don't know if I've encountered someone with the depth of intelligence that you have. Maybe Josh, But you are, and you've been very open, and you've been very cordial to my questions and to my, especially coming from me, that I needed you to talk down to me. And I appreciate you having the ability to do that and not be condescending or be angry or whatever. So I appreciate the way you've handled this, and even me walking in at the beginning when you were on and saying, "Who is this guy?"
No, that's great. That's great.
I appreciate you very, very much, and I hope we can do this again and maybe get into a different topic and bring you back on, because I found you fascinating, and thank you.
I would like that. And as far as, and once again, like, as far as to what things are important in life, my profession is literally just me staring at rocks and them yelling out that God is good, basically. And so I'm just that weird guy staring at rocks. There's nothing special about it.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much.
Yeah. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, we would love for you to like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, ring the bell for notifications so that you can be alerted each time we put out a new video, have a new conversation with a fascinating person being life in their world. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd love for you to give us a follow. Rating and reviewing is always appreciated. And just once again, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you again next time.